Most of you are familiar with tracking IOCs related to threat groups, malware families, and so on. This is commonly one of the first steps that we take when we're doing threat intelligence and we're trying to keep track of threat activity. But there's a lot of additional information that we want to be aware of. These include things like techniques and TTPs. What are the capabilities of a particular malware family and how it might operate in our environment? What are the techniques that various threat actors are using to carry out their operations so that we can better understand that in order to defend our networks? We're also interested in things like targeting, what organizations or industries are being attacked by different threat actors so that we can better understand who is at risk and how to protect them. And finally, do we have any assessments about what the goals and objectives are for the groups that we're interested in tracking so that we can better plan and anticipate their activity? Synapse allows you to work not only with these tactical IOCs, but also with these bigger picture, more strategic and operational aspects of threat activity and track and view them within Synapse as well. And our recently released Vertex-Threat-Intel Power-Up allows you to do this. The Power-Up installs what we call a workflow. It's accessible through the Workflows tool. When you open that up and you search, you can identify the Vertex-Threat-Intel workflow and select Threat Intel to load the Analyst Workflow panel. A workflow in Synapse is a custom UI element that allows me as an analyst to focus specifically on the data and types of analysis that are most interesting to me. I can work with all of this data through Synapse's standard research tool, but the workflow simplifies my focus and allows me to deep dive into the things that I'm most interested in. So for the Threat Intel Power-Up, we divided the workflow into two panels. On the left, we have what we call the selection panel that allows me to view and work with a number of different types of activity or threat intelligence objects. And on the right-hand side, we have what we call the profile panel, where if I select a specific object from my selection panel, I can view the profile or the detailed information about the object on the right. So in this case, I'm looking at what we call a threat cluster. This is a group called Armageddon that's been reported on by the Security Service of the Ukraine, the SSU, and I can see information related to this group. So I have kind of a high-level summary of information. I have additional names that this group may be known by in other public reporting. I have the tag that we use internally to annotate objects associated with this group, and if I want to view those objects, I can use this Lift Associated Nodes button to flip back and see those in the research tool. But besides this overview of the group, I can also see additional information. I can see the tools and software that this group has been reported as using. I can see the techniques associated with their activity and how they carry out their operations, vulnerabilities that the group has been reported to exploit, specific targeting associated with the group in terms of countries, particular industries that they've been known to focus on, and any assessed goals that they may have. Finally, I can see any linked reporting related to this group as well. So the workflow gives me a great way to be able to see this kind of high-level overview of the more operational and strategic aspects of this threat group, and I can easily view it through this one place. Now, as we mentioned, this is information that we can always work with in the research tool. So I can lift the node, the risk threat node that's associated with this threat cluster, and view this same information through the research tool. I can use my Explore button to navigate through this group and view some of that same information, such as the tag that we use to annotate those nodes, the organization reporting on this group, the different names that the group may be known by, and so on. All of this information is still available through the research tool. The workflow simply gives me a much more focused way to look at it. And one of the nice things about Synapse is that some of our third-party power-ups that have access to this type of information will populate it for you. So there are power-ups that will create these threat clusters and tools and techniques and so forth that allow you to work with them directly through the tool. So what are a couple of use cases for the workflow? Two of the main things that we're typically interested in tracking are threat groups or threat activity and malware families. So for this first part of our webinar, I'm going to talk about how we can use the workflow for those two aspects. In part two, we'll show you later on how you can work with different types of activities, specifically attacks, compromises, and campaigns to track and record that information as well. But from a threat tracking perspective, When we talk about threats within Vertex or within the workflow, we tend to divide them into two types. We talk about threat clusters and we talk about threat groups. And threat groups start out as threat clusters. A threat cluster can be thought of as a set of preliminary information about activity that we or a third party are seeing, where we may not yet know exactly who this group is or how they operate or what they're up to, but we've seen some activity that we know is bad, and we want to keep track of this going forward, because ideally we will research this group, we'll perform some threat hunting to try to build it out, or we may simply want to annotate it and kind of park it in case we see some additional related activity down the road, but it represents kind of this initial starting point for the activity that we're looking at. So let's say that as the Vertex project, we identified a spear phishing email, and we want to use this phishing message as the starting point for some new activity. When we create a threat cluster within Vertex, we literally take one or two indicators, a small number of indicators of compromise that we identified and caught our attention, and that's why we want to track this and build it out. And we'll make this the starting point or the seed for our new threat cluster. So in this case, we saw a phishing email, and these two nodes, the file, the actual email message, and the extracted header information, which we parsed out with the Synapse file parser, represent the starting point or the seed for this group that we're calling Wobbly Emu. So we've annotated these nodes with that seed tag. Looking at the email message, we can look at the body of the message and see that the message had a malicious link. We've gone out, retrieved the file from that link, done some analysis, and started to build out a set of indicators that we can link together and that we associate with this Wobbly Emu group. So we now have our initial cluster. These green nodes represent the indicators or the objects that we've tagged with this Wobbly Emu tag. So this is kind of all basic threat tracking so far. We have nodes and we have objects that we've labeled to indicate that they're part of this threat activity. But two things to notice. One is that this is literally a cluster of nodes. These are all linked together in the graph. So from my seed starting point, everything that I've built out to include within my cluster is literally linked through some path to those original seed nodes. And the other thing is that this cluster is actually fairly small. We don't have a ton of information. It's just one phishing message and some associated malware, but we want to be able to track this going forward. So far I've done my basic threat tracking, nodes and tags, but now I want to create an object to represent this Wobbly Emu threat cluster where I can record additional information about the activity that I'm seeing. And that's where the workflow comes into play. I switch back to my workflow, select my threat clusters tab, double check to make sure that one of my colleagues is not already working on Wobbly Emu. I don't see a threat cluster with that name, so I'm going to go ahead and create it. I can provide the name of my cluster, the organization that is reporting on or tracking this cluster, which is Vertex in this case, and I can create that object. Now I can record additional information, such as the tag that I'm using to annotate those nodes associated with my threat cluster, can provide a description and so on if I choose to, and now I can start to record additional information. Even though this is very preliminary data, just this sort of handful of nodes, there's still some higher level information that I can record about what I'm seeing. That includes some of the TTPs. If I'm able to analyze this activity and the file that was retrieved from that malicious link, and I'm able to identify a particular malware family that that file represents, I can add that malware family here through my Tools tab. Haven't done that analysis yet, but I can at least add some techniques that I'm seeing. Even though Wobbly Emu is just this little tiny cluster so far, I can at least say, hey, Wobbly Emu engages in phishing attacks, and not only do they phish, but they used a malicious link as opposed to a malicious attachment. So I can easily start adding these TTPs that I've observed with my preliminary cluster. Now, a few things to notice about these techniques. One is that for each technique, we have the option to map it to a related MITRE attack technique. So many organizations use attack to provide kind of a common language to talk about threats and threat activity. So any technique that you create in Synapse can be mapped directly to a MITRE technique, or you can take the MITRE techniques themselves and create an entire set of techniques and just use those. The other thing to notice is that a technique can be associated with a tag. So this not only gives me a high-level description of the technique and what it is and how it's used, but I can also use the tag to annotate nodes that represent evidence of that technique being used. If I'm going to track a group called Wobbly Emu, and I'm going to say Wobbly Emu engages in phishing attacks, it's nice if I can actually point to evidence in Synapse, point to a node that is associated with Wobbly Emu and has been labeled to indicate this is an example, this is evidence of them using a phishing message. Same thing with a malicious link. I can annotate an object in Synapse to say, hey, this is Wobbly Emu, and this is evidence that they use malicious links in their phishing. So you can also leverage those tags associated with techniques to annotate the data and go from that detailed evidence view back up to this more higher level operational view of how the group works. Now, there's still additional detail that I can record about my group. This phishing message represents an attack. It was sent to a particular organization. And if I do a little bit of research on the domain associated with that email address, I find that that domain, things I can't pronounce, saima.lv, is associated with the Latvian parliament. So this phishing message was sent to an address associated with that organization. I now have some targeting and potential victimology. So I can create an attack node to represent this particular attempt to compromise the victim environment. And I can use that date from the email message as the time of the attack. I can easily create that object through my workflow. If I go to my Activity Attacks tab, I can create a new attack. And I'm not going to worry about spelling. And create that node. I can add the time of the attack based on that information. So I have the date of the phishing email. And if I have any higher level information about the attack itself, if I know it was part of a compromise, if I assess it was part of a broader campaign, I can record that information. If I want to record TTPs and targeting specific to the attack, I can easily do that through this tab. So if I want to say, for example, this attack targeted government at the national level, this was a parliament, then I can add those here. Once I've created the attack node, I can go back and associate that with my threat cluster. So from the Activity tab, I can look up that attack that I just created and link the selected node. So I now have an attack associated with my threat cluster. I can move on to targeting to indicate that the group targeted Latvia, that they specifically targeted the Latvian parliament, and so on. All of that can be mapped out through the workflow. So even though I just have this tiny cluster with a handful of IOCs, I can start building up this additional operational and strategic view. Because as we track activity, we may link disparate sets of activity together through technical indicators, through things like shared infrastructure or similarities in malware coding and so on. But we also want to look at that operational data as well. I may have two sets of activity that don't necessarily overlap in terms of infrastructure or technical indicators, but if there are enough similarities in terms of things like malware used or TTPs and so forth, I may be able to use that more operational data to ultimately decide that two groups are part of the same set of activity as well. And the workflow allows me to record that information and easily view and compare it. So one example as to how we can use the workflow to help track specific threats that we're interested in. Now, Wobbly Emu started out here as a threat cluster, just based on this phishing message I saw that I thought was interesting, that I wanted to start keeping track of moving forward. Over time, hopefully I'll build up additional information related to this group. I'll identify other indicators of compromise that I can link to them. Hopefully I'll identify other activity or campaigns or attacks that they are associated with. And over time, one of two things will tend to happen. Either Wobbly Emu will kind of bump into another cluster that I'm already tracking, and I'll decide to merge those together as representing one larger set of activity. Or maybe wobbly emu just kind of grows on its own for some time and eventually becomes large enough and doesn't overlap with something that I decide it really should be its own kind of self-contained authoritative group. Either way, at some point I can decide to promote or graduate my threat cluster into a more formal threat group. And there's an easy way for me to do that. Threat clusters and tools in the workflow have something called a consistency check button. And this is a little set of checks I can run in the background to decide, is there anything about the way I'm representing this data, or maybe I missed something, or there's something that I want to consider or possibly address in terms of how I'm tracking it. I can run those consistency checks at any time to get a pop-up window to let me know things that I might want to take care of. In this case, I have two messages. One is that, hey, I indicated a reporting organization. I said, this is a threat cluster that's being tracked by Vertex, but I didn't link this cluster, this reported information, to the actual Vertex organization. That's an oversight, and it's an easy one to fix, so I'm going to go ahead and link that. But more importantly, here's a second one. I've created a threat cluster called Wobbly Emu, but I have not created an organization, a threat group, to represent Wobbly Emu itself. And when I first create my threat cluster, I don't want to do this because I don't know who Wobbly Emu is. They may eventually link up to another group that's more well-defined, more authoritative. So I don't necessarily want to create a formal Wobbly Emu threat group from the start. But over time, if the group grows and I'm confident that it is its own independent, self-contained thing, I can use my inconsistencies or my consistency checker to automatically create a threat group. Now I have an organization node representing Wobbly Emu that is linked to my original threat cluster. So I can eventually promote my cluster up to being something a little bit more formal once I know more about it. So this is showing how I can use the workflow to track my threat information. Another great use case for the workflow and the associated data model is to help me track not only my reporting, but third-party reporting as well. If you notice when we talked about threat clusters, each cluster has a name, the group that's being reported on, but also an associated reporter. So I can keep track of what Trend Micro calls Gamma-Redan separately from what the SSU calls Armageddon. And I can keep this information separate, but then I can also check for overlaps and inconsistencies and see where these might line up. And this helps me as an analyst try to make sense of all of the third-party reporting I'm trying to keep track of, and to try to determine which of these things being talked about in public reporting might actually be the same, and how do I cross-reference them and potentially link them together. So let's show an example of that. Let's say that as Vertex, I am tracking another set of activity that we call Fortunate Frog. And looking at my Fortunate Frog activity, once again, I have a nice little set of clustered nodes, those green objects that you're seeing linked together in the graph here. But looking at the tags associated with all of these objects, I can see that there's some overlap with what Talos calls Mustang Panda. So these sort of peach-colored nodes that are embedded with my Fortunate Frog cluster, they're pretty tightly embedded in there. I'm not seeing any little nodes floating off to the side. So there seems to be a decent amount of overlap between what Vertex calls Fortunate Frog and what Talos calls Mustang Panda. So I may decide, digging into this a little bit more, that the two separate organizations are actually talking about the same thing. These are two separate names used to refer to the same set of threat activity. Now I have threat clusters to represent both my Fortunate Frog and Talos's Mustang Panda. And one way that I can indicate these are the same is to create a threat group and link both of these clusters to that group. So I can take my Fortunate Frog cluster, I can use my consistency checks to prompt me to create a threat group for Fortunate Frog. Once I've done that and I have my threat group, I can decide that I want to add Talos's Mustang Panda to my threat group and indicate, these two clusters represent effectively the same activity. And I can add Mustang Panda as an additional name that this activity might be known as. Now, when we looked at our threat clusters, you'll notice that there are other organizations that are reporting on something called Mustang Panda. So I may also want to see information from these other organizations reporting to try to decide if there is additional overlap, and should I be tracking all of this data as the same thing. And when we look at all of the annotated nodes that we have in Synapse for these other things called Mustang Panda, I'm not seeing the same tight clustering. We still have our Fortunate Frog cluster in green down at the bottom, but I've got a lot of little nodes kind of floating off by themselves. And even in some of these areas where it looks like we've got decent overlap, that common point here is simply the fact that these are all PE executables. So that's not significant from an analytical standpoint. If I remove that node, we've got even less overlap. So at this point, I may not be willing to decide that what CrowdStrike calls Mustang Panda or what SecureWorks calls Bronze President correspond to Fortunate Frog and this little threat group that I've got going. So I may want to leave this for now until I have time to perform some more analysis and be more certain about my attribution. And I have the flexibility to do that. I can keep my authoritative threat group limited to just these two clusters and wait until I have more information. On the other hand, maybe my organization is not specifically concerned with precise attribution of activity. I'm just trying to make sense of the whole mess of reporting that's out there so that I can wrap my brain around it and use that information to defend my network. So if I simply want to know what is all of the reporting that's occurring that overlaps with this Fortunate Frog Mustang Panda namespace, I can decide that the precise attribution side of it is not important for my purposes. I just want to be able to identify all of the reporting on Mustang Panda and link that together. I have the option to do that as well. Either way, the workflow makes it easy. It's just a matter of what my particular organization's approach to analysis is and what my analytical needs are. So another way we can leverage the workflow is to help us make sense of this third-party reporting and how we can potentially cross-reference and link those things together. So far, I've walked you through how we can leverage this in terms of tracking threat activity, threat clusters, and threat groups. But there's effectively a parallel structure for how we can track malware families. Those reside under the TTPs section. And just as we start out threat groups as preliminary threat clusters, we can record malware families and tools, starting out with the Tools tab. This is a risk tool software node for those of you that want the mappings to the Synapse data model. But similar to the way I can record a threat cluster using a name and a reporting organization, I can use tools and malware families, same thing, tools, malware families, interchangeable, to record the name of a tool along with the organization that's reporting on that name. So for example, Talos is reporting on Meterpreter, MITRE's reporting on another one I can't pronounce, Teredo malware, and keep track of these and cross-reference them and so on. As I identify malware families or tools that are more authoritative or that I'm more comfortable have been well-defined and well-scoped, I can promote those into software nodes and make them a little bit more official. So for example, if we have multiple organizations that are reporting on something called PlugX, and I dig into this and decide they're all really talking about the same thing, I can create a software node to say I want to represent all of this public reporting on PlugX by whatever people call it, and then link these various organizations' reporting to my authoritative PlugX software, and I'm able to easily do that. This is not only true for malware families, but this is true for legitimate software tools utilities that might be used for malicious activity. So for example, we were tracking something called AD-Find. This was showing up in different organizations' reporting, talked about as a tool that's being used by some groups. So PT Security reported that this was being used by Lazarus in some of their blogs and public reporting. SecureWorks was reporting that this was being used by Bronze President. So we dug into this thing called AD-Find, and we determined that this is a utility that you can download freely from the internet. It's available from a website called Joeware. So we wanted to make an authoritative software node to represent AD Find and the different organizations that were reporting on what we assessed to be the same tool. So we actually went out to JoeWare website, to the associated URL. We downloaded a representative copy of this tool so that we at least have a representative sample in Synapse that we've labeled and tagged with our annotations to represent this tool. And we have our tool node, our risk tool software node, representing this object, but we've also created this authoritative AD Find software object to say, hey, when Vertex talks about AD Find and SecureWorks talks about it and PT Security talks about it, we're all talking about the same thing. And then we can still record that detail, give an authoritative description of the tool. In this case, a link where you can download it. We can track TTPs and so forth associated with the tool. What are the techniques that it leverages, who's using it, and so on, all through the workflow. So this has been an overview as to how we can use the threat intelligence workflow to help us track things like threat actors, threat activity, malware families, tools, and so on, both to record some of that higher level operational and strategic data related to both of these objects, cross-reference that back with objects in the research tool and the Synapse data model, and simplify working with some of these slightly more abstract elements, big picture elements of the activity that we're trying to keep track of. As we mentioned, if you join us for part 2, we'll talk in more depth about the workflow and how we can use it to track attacks and compromises in campaigns. But in the meantime, the Power-Up is out in beta. The second beta was cut yesterday. So if you are a Synapse customer, or if you have or would like to request a Synapse demo instance, you can install the Power-Up and check it out. We do have user documents for the Power-Up to allow you to dig in a little bit more deeper into how it works. But we appreciate you attending today. We welcome your feedback, and we hope to see you for part 2. Thank you very much.